He walked into La Scala every Friday night at exactly 8 p.m. 6'2", black suit, eyes like a storm that had already destroyed everything in its path. Every waiter in Chicago knew the rule. Table 7 belongs to Dylan Farah. Do not approach unless spoken to. Do not make eye contact. Do not spill anything. Do not breathe wrong. 3 servers had quit because of him. 2 had cried in the back kitchen. 1 had actually fainted. But on a cold Friday in November, a girl from nowhere named Cassidy Monroe put on her apron, grabbed her notepad, and walked straight toward Table 7, and nothing was ever the same again. The staff at La Scala Ristorante on West Randolph Street had a lot of unspoken rules. Don't eat the bread before service. Don't let Chef Ricardo catch you using your phone. Don't overpour the Barolo for Table 12 because Mr. Patterson, a retired banker who came every Thursday, would tip poorly if he thought you were trying to rush him. And above all else, above every other rule whispered between waitstaff in the cramped back hallway that smelled like garlic butter and cigarette smoke, was the one that everyone learned before they ever tied their first apron: do not volunteer for Table 7 on Friday nights. It wasn't written anywhere. It wasn't part of the official La Scala employee handbook that manager Glenn Hartley handed to every new hire along with their polo shirt and a packet of tax forms, but it was known. The way certain things are just known in a city like Chicago, the way you know not to stand too close to the platform edge on the red line, or not to say anything critical about the Bears to a man who's already 2 beers deep. Dylan Farah owned Table 7. Not literally, of course. He wasn't listed on the lease. But when you tipped $2,000 in cash after a single dinner, when you'd been coming to the same restaurant every Friday for 4 years without missing a single week except for one February when the city was locked down, and even then he'd reportedly sent his driver, Sal Benedetti, to pick up the kitchen's entire weekly inventory just to keep them afloat when you were that man. Certain courtesies were extended without question. The corner table, the best view of the room and of the entrance, 2 bottles of 2016 Giacomo Conterno Barolo opened and breathing before he arrived. A bread basket with rosemary focaccia, not the plain ciabatta. The lights in his section turned down 3 notches below the rest of the dining room. These were not preferences he expressed anymore. They simply happened, quietly and efficiently, the way the tide comes in without needing to be asked. Nadia Petrov, a Russian-American woman who'd been a senior server at La Scala for 6 years, and who was, by every measure, the best at her job, had personally handled Table 7 for most of those 4 years. She was tall, composed, unflappable. She'd once served a table where 2 men began screaming at each other in what appeared to be a genuine dispute about a real estate deal gone wrong, and she'd simply asked if they'd like to hear the dessert specials. Nadia was not afraid of difficult customers, but Nadia was afraid of Dylan Farah. She wouldn't say it that way. She'd say she simply had a professional methodology for managing him. She'd learned exactly what he wanted and delivered it so perfectly that there was no friction, no opportunity for him to turn his gaze on her with that particular flat expression that made the base of your spine go cold. She'd learned not to ask how his evening was going. She'd learned not to suggest anything. She'd learned to be invisible while being present, a difficult paradox that had taken her 6 months to master. You become like furniture, she told the newer servers. Nice furniture, expensive furniture, but furniture. So when Nadia came down with a brutal stomach virus the second Friday in November and called out sick at 3 p.m. just 5 hours before Dylan Farah's standing reservation, the quiet panic that moved through the La Scala staff was almost audible. You could feel it in the way Glenn Hartley went still when he got the call, the way he sat at his desk for a solid 45 seconds without moving, staring at his schedule. "I'll take it," said a voice from the doorway. Glenn looked up. Cassidy Monroe had been working at La Scala for exactly 11 days. She was 26 years old, from a small town called Mill Haven in southern Ohio, and she had moved to Chicago 3 months ago with a duffel bag, a second-hand winter coat that was already proving insufficient for a Midwest November, and a determination that her long-time college friend, Britt Calloway, kept describing to mutual acquaintances as slightly alarming. She had waitressing experience 4 years at a place called Patton's Grill back in Mill Haven, which Glenn had confirmed when he hired her was not exactly comparable to La Scala, but showed she could carry plates and handle pressure. She was quick. She was sharp. She'd already memorized the full menu and the wine list in her first week, which had genuinely impressed Nadia. She was also, demonstrably, not afraid of things she probably should be afraid of. Cassidy. Glenn chose his words carefully. "You don't understand what you're volunteering for. I've handled difficult tables before. Not like this. Then I'll figure it out." There was a long pause. Around the kitchen, 3 line cooks had stopped pretending to prep vegetables and were openly watching. Tomas, the busboy who'd been at La Scala for 11 years and had personally witnessed 2 servers cry and 1 practically faint over table 7, leaned against the pass-through and waited to see how this ended. Glenn pinched the bridge of his nose. "He tips well, I'll say that." "Good," said Cassidy. "I need rent money." She picked up her notepad and walked back to the floor. He arrived at 8:01 p.m. Cassidy had been watching the door, which she knew was something experienced servers tried not to do because it made you look anxious. She watched anyway. Dylan Farah walked into La Scala, the way certain people walk into rooms, not with arrogance. Exactly. But with a density of presence that made the air shift. He was 41 years old, dark hair, streaked at the temples with grey that had appeared, according to Chicago gossip circles, sometime in his mid-30s after a particularly difficult year that nobody who knew the details talked about openly. His face was not classically handsome in the soft, agreeable way of men in magazine advertisements. It was harder than that, architectural, the kind of face that had seen things and had decided, somewhere along the way, to stop being surprised by them. He was followed by 2 men who positioned themselves at a table near the entrance, not eating, just present. His security. Everyone in the restaurant pretended not to notice them. He sat down at table 7 without looking at the host stand, without waiting to be led. He settled into his chair the way someone settles into the only chair in a room that actually fits them. Cassidy waited 45 seconds long enough to let him get settled, short enough not to let the Barolo sit too long without acknowledgement, and walked over. "Good evening," she said. "I'm Cassidy. I'll be taking care of you tonight." He looked up. The look was precisely what Nadia had described. Flat. Assessing. The kind of look that categorized a person in about 3 seconds, and then filed them somewhere specific. "Where's Nadia?" he said. Not a question. A statement with a question mark missing. "She's sick tonight. She'll be back next Friday." A pause. "Fine," he said, and looked back at the menu he clearly already knew by heart. Cassidy could feel the collective exhale from across the restaurant, Phase 1 complete. She poured his Barolo, gave him space, came back in 8 minutes exactly. He ordered without looking at the menu, which she'd expected. Seared branzino, arugula salad with no walnuts, the burrata to start. She wrote it down, read it back, and started to turn away. "You're new," he said. She turned back. 11 days. "Millhaven," he said. She went still. "Excuse me, your accent, Southern Ohio, small town." He said it the way people state the weather, factual, detached. There's a particular flatness to the vowels. Cassidy looked at him for a moment. "That's very observant. I pay attention to things." "So do I," she said. And she wasn't entirely sure why she said it, only that it felt like the honest response. She walked back to the kitchen, behind the pass-through. Tomas was staring at her with an expression of quiet disbelief. "He talked to you," he said. "He makes conversation, apparently. He asked Jenna from accounting once why the bread was warm, and she actually started crying. The bread should always be warm, Cassidy said, and checked on table 12. The problem happened at 9:17 p.m. It was not her fault, and she knew it wasn't her fault, and the knowing did not make it better. A couple at the table, directly adjacent to Dylan Farah's table 8. A pair of people on what was clearly a first date based on the formal body language and the way the man kept checking his phone under the table, had ordered a bottle of sparkling water. When Cassidy came around to refill their glasses, the woman shifted suddenly in her chair, in the way people shift when they've been sitting in one position too long, and her elbow caught the glass just as Cassidy was pouring. The water went sideways, directly onto Dylan Farah's left sleeve. The room went very quiet. It was not Cassidy's fault. The geometry of it was clear, the woman's elbow, the angle of the glass, the physics of liquid in motion. But fault was beside the point. The water was on his sleeve. His expression, when he turned to look at what had happened, was the specific expression of a man who had decided a very long time ago that things like this didn't happen to him. "I am so sorry," said the woman from table 8, her face the color of raw salmon. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean—" "Excuse me," Cassidy said. Stepping forward, she had a clean cloth over her arm, the way she always did during service. She stepped between the table 8 couple and Dylan Farah's line of sight, not blocking him. Exactly, but redirecting the geography of the moment. "Mr. Farah," she said, keeping her voice level and professional. "I'm so sorry about that. May I?" She offered the cloth, not in a fawning, panicked way, in the way of someone who has assessed a situation and determined the most efficient solution. He looked at her, then at the cloth. Then he held out his sleeve. She blotted the water, carefully, efficiently. His watch, a Patek Philippe, that she later learned cost approximately the same as a year of her rent, was undamaged. The sleeve would be fine once dry. "The branzino will be ready in about 4 minutes, she said, handing the cloth back to herself. "Can I get you anything in the meantime?" Another of those long, assessing pauses. "No," he said. She nodded and went to quietly reassure the table 8 couple, who looked like they were considering never going out in public again. When she brought Dylan Farah's branzino, he looked at it, then at her. "You handled that well," he said. "Part of the job," she said. "Most people panic." "Panic doesn't dry sleeves," she said, and she genuinely wasn't sure if that was a clever thing to say or a reckless one until she saw the very corner of his mouth, just the corner, do something that might. In another man, have been the beginning of a smile. She left him to his dinner. At the end of the night, the bill was settled by one of the men from the door table. In the envelope with the receipt was a stack of bills that Cassidy counted in the back hallway, her hands very still. $3,400 on a $400 dinner. Tomas looked over her shoulder at the stack. "Welcome to table 7, he said. She told Britt about it over the phone that weekend. Sitting on the floor of her apartment, she still didn't have a couch eating leftover pasta and trying to describe the specifics of a man who was, by any reasonable social standard, someone she should have zero interest in. "He sounds terrifying," Britt said. "He's not terrifying. He's just very still. Cassidy, he's a mob boss. Allegedly. The Tribune has literally written 3 articles about him." "Those articles are very vague," Cassidy said. Which was true. Dylan Farer's name appeared in connection with certain import businesses, certain real estate holdings, certain conversations that the federal government had reportedly found interesting enough to examine, and then, apparently, found insufficient grounds to act upon. What appeared in the Chicago Tribune was circumstantial and carefully worded, the kind of journalism that suggested without asserting, which told you something about both the journalism and the subject. "He tips $3,000, Cassidy added. Britt went quiet for a moment. "How bad is the apartment situation?" she finally asked. "There's currently a gap in the window frame that I've plugged with a rolled-up cardigan." "Okay," Britt said. "Just be careful." Cassidy said she would be. She meant it. She just wasn't entirely sure what being careful looked like yet in this particular context. The second Friday. Nadia was back. She came in looking pale and thinner than she'd been the week before. The stomach virus had been genuinely unpleasant. Apparently and immediately began her pre-service preparation for table 7 with the focused efficiency of someone who knew exactly how much was at stake. She had already tied her apron when Glenn cleared his throat from the office doorway. "He asked for Cassidy," Glenn said. The kitchen went very quiet again. Nadia turned around slowly. "I'm sorry." "He called at noon." Glenn had the look of a man who was both deeply uncomfortable and deeply committed to accuracy. He called and spoke to Janet at the front desk. He asked that his server tonight be the new girl. "Cassidy." Nadia blinked. Once. Then she looked at Cassidy, who was standing at the schedule board pretending to read it. "What did you do?" Nadia asked, not accusingly, more like a scientist presenting a hypothesis. "I just served him," Cassidy said. "He has never in 4 years requested anyone." "Well," Cassidy said, and truly did not know what else to add to that. She took table 7. This Friday was different in ways that were subtle but unmistakable to anyone paying attention. And Cassidy was always paying attention. He arrived at 8:01 p.m., again to the minute, as though he was synchronized to something no one else could see. He sat. He accepted the Barolo, but when Cassidy came to take his order, he did not immediately look at the menu. "The branzino again?" she asked. "Not tonight." He looked at the menu. Actually looked at it. For the first time, she suspected, in a long while. "What do you recommend?" She didn't hesitate. "The short rib. Chef Ricardo changes the preparation quarterly, and this month's version is the best I've tasted since I started." "You've tasted it." "Staff meal. 2 Tuesdays ago. I told Chef it was exceptional, and he looked at me like I'd personally offended him by being from Ohio." The corner of the mouth thing happened again. Clearer this time. "The short rib," he said. She brought the short rib. He ate it with the measured attention of someone who took food seriously. Halfway through the plate, he set down his fork and asked, without preamble, why she had moved to Chicago. It was such a direct, personal question from a man who had presented himself as entirely transactional that she was momentarily genuinely caught off guard. To start over, she said. Then, because that was probably too honest, I wanted a bigger city, more opportunity. Start over from what? She looked at him. That's a second date question. Mr. Fairer. A pause. The flat eyes did something complicated. Dylan, he said. I'm sorry. My name, it's Dylan. I know what your name is, she said. I'll let you finish your dinner. She walked away and did not let herself look back, because some instincts are worth trusting. And her instinct said that in whatever negotiation was currently taking place, the person who looked back first lost something important. The third Friday brought a man named Brett Holloway. Brett was 29, lean in the careless way of someone who'd been naturally athletic in college and hadn't completely lost it yet. And he had been, until approximately 8 months ago. Cassidy's fiancée. He had driven up from Millhaven a 5-hour drive in November rain, and he was sitting at the bar when Cassidy came out of the kitchen at 7:45 p.m. and nearly walked directly into him. Cass, he said. She stopped. Her whole body went through the particular sequence that happens when you encounter someone you've consciously stopped allowing yourself to think about the recognition. The involuntary memory cascade, the rapid reassembly of the wall you'd built over the past 8 months. Brett, what are you doing here? I needed to talk to you. You haven't been returning my calls. That's because I don't want to talk to you. He had the grace, at least, to look ashamed. Brett Holloway was not a bad person in any dramatic sense. He was a specific kind of person, the kind who made ordinary, cowardly choices, and then was genuinely bewildered by their consequences. He had, 8 months ago, kissed Cassidy's former co-worker, Sienna Garza, at a 4th of July party. Cassidy had found out not from Brett, but from 2 separate people who'd assumed she already knew. Brett had explained that he'd been confused about a lot of things, and that he thought they'd gotten too comfortable, which was the particular way people described a relationship when they meant to blame the relationship for their own behavior. She had ended the engagement, packed 2 bags, and started seriously researching Chicago apartments within 48 hours. Britt Calloway had always said Cassidy's defining characteristic was that she was not someone who lingered. Please, Brett said. Just 10 minutes. I drove 5 hours. You can drive 5 hours back, she said, and she would have left it there. She was perfectly capable of leaving it there, except that the door opened at exactly 8:01 p.m. and Dylan Fairer walked into La Scala. His gaze went to table 7 with the practiced ease of a man surveying his regular geography. Then, in the way she'd come to understand, was simply how he operated. It moved across the room, a brief, efficient sweep, and landed on her. And on Brett, standing at the bar next to her. And on the particular body language of the conversation they were having, which was not the body language of friendly acquaintances. His expression did not change. He walked to table 7, sat down, and picked up the Barolo. Cassidy turned back to Brett. I'm working. You need to go. Just let me take you to dinner after your shift. Brett. Cassidy. I miss you. I miss us. I made a mistake, and I've spent 8 months trying to... I know you've spent 8 months on it, she said. But I used those 8 months to build something else. Please don't do this here. He looked at her for a long moment. Brett Holloway was the kind of man who'd been told he was a good person so many times that he'd come to believe it was a fixed attribute rather than a daily practice. And the look on his face now was the look of someone encountering evidence to the contrary and finding it deeply unfair. "Is there someone else?" he asked. "That's not the point." He glanced across the restaurant in the way people glance when they're trying to understand the geography of a situation. His gaze landed on table 7, on Dylan Farah, who was apparently very interested in his Barolo. "Him," Brett said, with a kind of baffled, incredulous laugh. "The guy in the corner, Cassidy. Who is he?" "He's a customer," she said, "and I need to go do my job. Goodbye." Brett. She walked across the restaurant to table 7. She was aware that Brett was still at the bar. She was aware that the walk across the floor felt, in this particular moment, very long. "Evening," she said to Dylan. He looked up. He did the brief, efficient thing where his eyes moved to the bar and back. "Trouble?" "Nothing I can't handle." She pulled out her notepad. "Short rib again, or are we exploring new territory?" A pause. "Who is he?" he asked. She looked at him directly. Second date question. Something shifted in his expression. Not the corner of the mouth thing. Something slower and more complicated. "The short rib," he said finally. She went back to the kitchen. When she came back out, Brett was gone. She didn't ask anyone how that had happened. She had a feeling she didn't want to know. She Googled him. She knew she shouldn't, and she did it anyway. Sitting in her apartment on a Sunday with her coffee and her second-hand blanket, she'd bought a couch by then. A good one, paid for in cash, and she read everything the public record offered on Dylan Farah. It was both more and less than she expected. The Tribune pieces, a Chicago Magazine profile from 2019 that was carefully complimentary about his legitimate business holdings, the import company, Farah and Associates, which brought in Italian and Spanish goods, a restaurant group that included La Scala and 3 other establishments across the city, a real estate portfolio that covered 8 commercial properties in the Loop and River North. He appeared twice in photographs at charity galas, once for the Children's Memorial Hospital Foundation, once for an arts endowment that bore the name of his late mother, Rosaria Farah, who had died 12 years ago. Then there was the other material, less official, a federal case from 2018 United States versus Moretti et al., in which Dylan Farah was named as an unindicted co-conspirator in a racketeering investigation before the case collapsed due to what the court documents called insufficient corroboration of witness testimony. Cassidy had read enough to understand that insufficient corroboration of witness testimony was often a polite way of saying that witnesses had become unwilling to testify, and the reasons for that unwillingness were rarely discussed in court documents. She knew what he was. She wasn't naive about it. She'd grown up in Millhaven, Ohio, which was small and quiet and in no way connected to organized crime. But she was 26, and she'd lived enough life to understand that the world contained categories of person that required careful navigation. And she sat with that knowledge for a long time, on her new couch, with her cooling coffee. Then she thought about the way he'd said Dylan, like it was a door he was choosing to open. She thought about the corner of the mouth thing and what it would cost him to allow it. She thought about Nadia saying, in 4 years, he has never requested anyone. She put her phone down and didn't make any decisions. But she stopped Googling. The fourth Friday, he was late. Not by much 6 minutes, but she'd noticed the pattern was military in its precision, and 6 minutes at 8 p.m. on a Friday at La Scala was perceptible. She'd already confirmed with the kitchen that the Barolo was breathing and the bread basket was assembled, and she'd spent those 6 minutes serving her other tables with the particular smooth surface efficiency that she deployed when she was thinking about something else. When he came in, he sat down and she came over, and he looked, for the first time, like a man who was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "Long week," she said, before she'd consciously decided to say anything at all. He looked at her. Not the flat assessment. Something different. "Yes," he said. She poured his Barolo. "Do you want to hear the specials, or should I just put in the short rib?" "I want to hear the specials," he said. She told him the specials. He listened to every word, which she'd noticed he always did. He listened with complete attention, the way some people do who have learned that information is always worth having. He ordered the duck this time, a new one, and then "Sit down," he said. She blinked. "I'm sorry." "For a moment." "Sit. Mr. She caught herself. "Dylan, I'm working a full floor. I have 6 tables. Tomas can cover for 3 minutes." She looked at him for a long moment. She was aware, in a background kind of way, that the restaurant had gone about 3 decibels quieter. She sat down. Not because he'd told her to. She was genuinely not someone who did things because she was told to, but because she was curious. She'd been curious about him since the first night, and she saw no compelling reason to pretend otherwise. "What happened?" she asked. He turned his wine glass slowly. "Someone I trusted made a decision they weren't authorized to make." "What kind of decision?" "The kind that has consequences." She held his gaze. "Are you all right?" He seemed briefly, genuinely startled by the question, as though it hadn't occurred to him to be asked. "People don't usually ask me that," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm asking anyway." A long silence. The kind that isn't uncomfortable, just honest. "I will be," he said, finally. She nodded. She stood up. "I'll get your duck." She went to the kitchen and stood at the pass-through for a moment with her hand flat on the cold metal surface. Steadying herself, Tomas appeared at her shoulder. Did he just invite you to sit down? He's having a hard week." "Cassidy, in 11 years I have watched that man make a busboy cry by looking at him wrong during a holiday party. He does not have hard weeks. He has hard weeks that other people suffer for." "Well," she said, and picked up the duck plate. "Maybe he needs someone to just ask. It happened on the 5th Friday, and it began with a man named Roy Falcone." Roy Falcone was 53 years old, broad in the shoulders, with the specific manner of a man who had spent his life being the most intimidating person in most rooms and had come to mistake that for authority. He ran the South Side operations of a network that, in polite company, was described as a logistics business. He and Dylan Farrer had been, at various points over the past decade, allies, competitors, and everything complicated in between. He was not someone who showed up at La Scala. Until the 5th Friday, when he walked in at 8:30 p.m. with 2 men and requested a table. Glenn Hartley, at the host stand, made a calculation in approximately 2 seconds that involved weighing the value of refusing a table against the value of not refusing it, and seated Roy Falcone and his companions at table 12, across the restaurant, at table 7, Dylan Farrer did not appear to notice. But Cassidy, who had been watching him long enough to understand his tells, saw the slight adjustment in how he held his wine glass, like he'd gripped it differently. She went about her service. She was professional. She did not let the specific atmosphere of the room, which had shifted in the way a room shifts when two things that don't belong together are suddenly in the same space, affect the efficiency of her work. At 9 o'clock p.m., Roy Falcone summoned her to table 12. "You," he said, with the casual disregard of someone who'd spent too long being allowed to address people however he chose. "You're his waitress." "I'm the server for this section." "Yes," she said, because she was not going to agree to the framing of his waitress. "Can I help you with something?" "Tell him Roy Falcone says hello." She looked at him steadily. "I'm a server, not a messenger service. Is there something I can get you from the kitchen?" Roy Falcone's two companions shifted slightly in their chairs, which was the body language equivalent of thunder before lightning. Roy himself looked at her with the particular expression of a man who was recalibrating. People, apparently, did not usually speak to him this way. "Watch yourself," he said quietly. "I'm just doing my job," she said. "Let me know if you'd like to see the dessert menu." She walked back toward table 7. She kept her pace even. She did not hurry. Dylan was watching her when she arrived. "Roy Falcone is at table 12, she said, before he could ask. "He told me to tell you he says hello. I declined to be the messenger." His eyes did something she hadn't seen before, alert in a specific way, like the moment before a decision. "What did he say to you?" Dylan said, very flat, very even. "He told me to watch myself." A pause that lasted maybe 4 seconds and felt like an hour. "Go take care of your other tables," he said. His tone was not unkind, but it was the tone of a man who needed to handle something and required space to do it. She nodded and went to table 4, where a couple was deciding between the tiramisu and the panna cotta. She recommended the panna cotta. She was aware, at the edge of her vision, of Dylan Farrer just standing, at his table, and of Roy Falcone at table 12 going very still. She didn't know exactly what happened between them. She was in the kitchen for 6 minutes, dropping off dessert orders. When she came back out, Roy Falcone's table was empty, all 3 of them. Gone. The wine they'd ordered, barely touched. Dylan was seated again, his expression unreadable. She came over. "Everything all right?" "He won't bother you again," he said. She looked at him. "Dylan, what did you—" "He won't bother you," he said again. "I gave you my word." She stood there for a moment in the particular silence that follows, when someone says something that doesn't fit the category you'd assigned them to. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know I didn't. Why did you—" He looked at her. Really looked at her. The full attention way he usually reserved for listening to things he intended to act on. "Because you handled him better than most of my people would have," he said. "And because he shouldn't have spoken to you that way." She was quiet for a long moment. "Thank you," she said. "You're welcome," said Dylan Farrer. She went to check on table 9. Her hands were completely steady, which she felt deserved some kind of personal recognition. At close of service, after the last table had settled their check, and Glenn had done the walk-through, and Tomas had finished resetting the linen, Dylan was still there. He'd stayed past his usual 10:15 p.m. departure. He was on his second glass of Barolo, which was unusual, He typically had one, perhaps 1.5. Cassidy was doing her side work at the service station when he spoke from across the now empty section. "Have dinner with me," he said. She looked up. "Not here," he said. "Somewhere else. Next week." She was quiet for a moment. "You know what I'd do," he said, before she could respond. "I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I think you already know, and I think you should say no. I think that's the reasonable thing." "I know," she said, "but I'm asking anyway." She looked at him across the empty restaurant, at the 2 bottles of Barolo and the bread basket and the corner table that the whole city of Chicago had learned to leave alone, and at the man sitting in the middle of all of it who'd asked a server from Millhaven, Ohio, to sit down with him because she'd been the first person in a long time to ask if he was all right. "Next Saturday," she said. "I'm off on Saturdays." He nodded once. "I'll have Sal pick you up at 7, he said. "I'll meet you there," she said. "Text me the address." Something in his expression shifted. Surprised? Maybe. And something that might have been appreciation. She'd established, quietly and clearly, that she would come on her own terms. "All right," he said. She went back to her side work. The dinner was at a private room at Osteria Moretti on North Wells Street, a restaurant that one of Dylan's entities apparently owned, which she quietly filed away as information rather than judgment. The private room was small, warm in the way that deliberate warmth always is not incidental, not accidental, but chosen. A single round table, actual candles, not the electric tea light kind that restaurants used when they wanted the impression of intimacy without committing to it. The menu had been printed on heavy cardstock and had no prices, which told her it had been composed specifically for the evening. She ran her thumb along the edge of it and said nothing about this. But she noticed it the way she noticed everything. He was different outside La Scala. She'd spent enough time watching people in the particular way that good servers watch people, which is closer to how a novelist watches people than most customers ever understand, to recognize the difference between a person in their performance and a person in something closer to their truth. At table 7, Dylan Farrer was precise, contained, armored in a way that had become so habitual it probably no longer felt like armor to him. Here, in this small room with its candles and its silence, something had settled differently. He was still, that was fundamental. That density of quiet, but it was a different kind of stillness. Less guarded, less maintained. He asked about Millhaven first, the way someone asks when they genuinely want to know the shape of a place, not just its name. She told him about growing up there, the specific smallness of it, the way everyone knew your family's business, and your parents' business, and your parents' parents' business, and how that could be a comfort or a cage depending on the year. She told him about her mother, Ruth Monroe, who taught 4th grade, and who could, by sheer force of cheerful persistence, make 9-year-olds care about fractions. About her father, Gary, who ran an HVAC business and who had a particular form of love that expressed itself in practical competence, fixing things. Showing up, making sure the truck had enough gas before you borrowed it, and who had been, quietly, consistently hopeful that Cassidy would eventually choose a steady life in a place he understood, though he loved her without conditions, regardless. She told him about Patton's Grill, 4 years of weekend doubles and bad tipping tables, and a head cook named Douglas who burned everything above medium and refused, on principle, to acknowledge it. She told him about saving money, about applying to La Scala from her apartment in Millhaven on a Tuesday night in August, about the broken engagement in a way that was honest without being excessive. She didn't give him Brett's name. He didn't ask for it. "You left because of him?" Dylan asked. "I left because leaving was what I was supposed to do," she said. "He was just the reason I did it when I did." He turned his wine glass slowly. "I understand that." She believed him. "What made you stay in Chicago?" She asked. "You could go anywhere. People with your resources go anywhere." He was quiet for a moment, and she let the quiet be what it was not a silence to fill, just a space where something real was being assembled. "My mother's buried here," he said. "My grandfather built the first thing this family ever owned, 3 blocks from where I went to school." He paused. "You don't leave those things." She nodded. And then, because she had learned that directness was almost always kinder than circling. "Tell me about her. Your mother." He looked at her. The assessment. Then something yielded. He talked about Rosaria Farah for 20 minutes. She didn't interrupt. She asked 2 questions, both of them careful. And mostly she just listened the way she'd learned to listen when someone was telling you the real version of a story, rather than the one they'd practiced. He talked about how his mother had made Sunday lunch every single week without exception, not just cooked made, which was a different word for a different thing. Set the table properly, used the good dishes that lived in the cabinet above the refrigerator, made sure there was enough for anyone who happened to come. Because Sunday lunch was the thing that said we are still a family, no matter what else was true outside the front door, no matter what his father was involved in, no matter what was going wrong or right or sideways in the business, that table was set every Sunday. He talked about her sitting with him at the kitchen table, working through algebra homework when she was already tired from her own job, because she'd decided he was going to understand mathematics, and that was simply the end of the discussion. About how she'd read to herself every night actual books, not the television, and about how she'd been the only person in his life, as he got older, whose opinion of him he'd never been able to make himself stop caring about. "She never asked you directly," Cassidy said slowly. "About the business. What it became." "No," he said. "But she knew. She knew." He was quiet. "She'd look at me sometimes, not often. She wasn't the kind of woman who made speeches, but sometimes she'd look at me with this expression I spent years trying to interpret. Like she was asking you to be different," Cassidy said. He shook his head, just slightly. "Like she already knew I was." He paused, but was waiting for me to realize it too. The silence that followed was honest in the way that silences between 2 people only become honest after the conversation has touched something real. Cassidy sat with it and didn't rush past it. She did not make him promises that evening. She was clear-eyed enough to know that promises made in candlelight in private rooms were the easiest kind to make, and often the most costly. She was not going to tell him she was the person who would change him, because she didn't believe that was how people worked. Real change was not something one person installed in another. It was something a person arrived at when they were finally ready, and the most anyone else could do was be present for the arriving. She wasn't a savior. She didn't want to be. But she was honest. That was the thing she could offer, that apparently few people in his life consistently offered direct speech, genuine observation, and the refusal to look away from what was actually in front of her. "This is going to be complicated," she said, near the end of the evening. Not as a warning, just as a fact that deserved to be spoken out loud. "Yes," he said. "I need you to understand that I'm not someone who can be managed or handled or kept. I know. And I need you to understand that I'm going to keep doing my job and being who I am. And if any part of that ever comes into conflict with any part of your—" "Cassidy." He said her name with a directness that stopped her mid-sentence, not impatiently, just with weight. "What?" "I asked you to dinner because of exactly who you are," he said, "not in spite of it." She looked at him for a long moment across the table, in the candlelight, in the small, warm room that he'd arranged and that she'd shown up to on her own terms, in her own car, having texted Britt the address just in case. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. 3 months later, Nadia found out, on a Tuesday, from Tomas, who'd found out from Hector Bautista, one of the line cooks who'd apparently spotted them at Osteria Moretti, and had held the information inside himself for 9 days, like a man trying to contain a small fire before finally, inevitably, telling someone. Nadia came to Cassidy during side work with the specific expression of a woman who had a significant number of feelings and was managing them with professional precision. "I need you to tell me," Nadia said, "that you are being careful." "I'm being careful," Cassidy said. "He is not." Nadia stopped, found a different door. "He is a specific kind of person." "I know what kind of person he is." Cassidy folded a napkin into a clean point. "I also know that he asked me to sit with him once when he was having a hard week, that he told Roy Falcone something that made the man leave a full bottle of wine on the table without a word, that he talks about his mother like she's the only person he was never performing for." She set the napkin down. "I'm not saying it's simple. I'm saying it's real." Nadia held her gaze for a long moment. Then she looked away, at the room, at the tables being reset around them. "Just," she said finally, "be careful." "Always am," said Cassidy. 6 months later, there was a federal inquiry. Not directly at Dylan, it never was. Directly, but at one of his associates, a man named Dean Portillo, who had apparently made the kind of unauthorized decision that Dylan had referenced once, on that tired Friday in November, with careful vagueness. The Tribune notification appeared on Cassidy's phone on a Tuesday morning, and she sat with it at her kitchen table for a long time, her coffee going cold beside her. Then she called Britt. "I know," Britt said, before she'd said anything. "I'm okay." "Are you?" "I'm thinking about it. That's different from okay." "Britt." Cassidy looked at her kitchen, at the second-hand prints she'd framed and hung in a row above the counter, at the good couch, at the fixed window frame, at the small assembled evidence of a life she'd built from nothing in less than a year. "I spent my whole life choosing the safe version of everything. Safe college, safe job, safe man who turned out to be safe for everyone except me." She paused. "I drove to this city in the rain with a duffel bag and a coat that was basically decorative. I walked straight to a table that 3 people had quit over. And I found someone who looks at me like I'm the most interesting thing in the room. And not because of what I can do for him. Not because of what I represent. Because of who I actually am." She stopped. "That's new. Britt. That's genuinely new." A long silence. "Okay," Britt said quietly. "I trust you." That Friday, She went to La Scala. She tied her apron in the back hallway that smelled like garlic butter and something permanently warm. She confirmed with the kitchen that the Barolo was breathing. She checked that the bread basket had rosemary focaccia. She took her section all 6 tables, and she moved through the first hour of service with the smooth efficiency of someone who had become, without quite marking the moment it happened, genuinely good at this. At 8:01 p.m., the door opened. Dylan Farrer walked in. He sat down at table 7. He looked at her with the full attention look, the one that meant he was present and not somewhere else. She came over, poured the Barolo. "Long week," she said. "Yes," he said. "Short rib, or are we experimenting?" He looked up at her, something in his face that was tired and honest, and underneath both of those things steady. "Experimenting," he said. "Surprise me." She put in the lamb. Chef Ricardo had debuted it that week, a slow-braised preparation with preserved lemon and something herbed that Cassidy had tasted at staff meal and declared extraordinary, causing Chef to look at her with the expression she'd come to understand was his version of deep satisfaction. She brought it. He ate with attention. When the plate was clean, he set down his fork. "The inquiry won't touch the restaurant," he said. "I need you to know that. Glenn. The staff, none of it." "I know," she said, because she did. "I'm going to need a few weeks to manage some things." "All right." He paused, chose his words with the care of a man who had spent years simply deciding rather than asking, and who was still learning that there was a difference. "I'd like it," he said. "If you'd still be here, on the other side of the few weeks." She looked at him for a moment, at this man with his storm-grey eyes, and his Sunday lunches, and his corner-of-the-mouth thing that cost him something every time he allowed it. "I serve table 7 every Friday," she said. "Same as always." The corner of his mouth moved, clearer than it had ever been. "Same as always," he said. She left him to his coffee. She had 4 other tables. She had side work and napkins to fold, and a text from her mother, Ruth, to answer, and 70 pages left in a novel she was rationing because she didn't want it to end. She had a life in Chicago, fully assembled and ongoing, and on Friday nights, at exactly 8:01 p.m., she had table 7. For now, that was enough. More than enough. In the particular arithmetic of a life built from scratch from a duffel bag and a bad coat and one very deliberate walk across a restaurant floor, it was precisely what it was supposed to be. She had never learned the habit of avoidance. She wasn't about to start now. And that is the story of Cassidy Monroe, a girl from a small Ohio town with a duffel bag, a broken engagement, and enough nerve to walk toward what everyone else ran from. She didn't change Dylan Farrer the way love stories promise. She didn't save him, fix him, or make the complicated world around him disappear. She did something rarer. She showed up as herself, without flinching, every single Friday, and gave him something he hadn't had in years, someone who saw him honestly and chose to stay anyway. That's not a fairy tale. That's something better. That's real. And sometimes real is the most romantic thing there is. If this story got to you, if you found yourself holding your breath at table 7 or feeling something in that last scene, then you already know this kind of storytelling is worth sharing. Like this video, share it with someone who loves a story that has actual weight to it. And subscribe because we drop new episodes every week, and the next one, it starts where Dylan Farrer's associate Dean Portillo makes a decision that changes everything. You do not want to miss it. We'll see you there.